The ice beneath Gwendolyn Nash's boots gave way with a sound like thunder, and in that suspended moment before gravity claimed her, she wondered if her brother would feel even a shred of remorse when they found her broken body at the bottom of the ravine. The thought vanished as quickly as the solid ground had, replaced by the terrifying rush of wind and the white blur of snow-covered rock face racing past her vision. Her scream tore from her throat, raw and primal, echoing off the frozen walls of the mountain pass as she clawed uselessly at the air. It was February 1884, and Gwendolyn had been running through the bitter cold of the Idaho mountains for 3 days straight, her lungs burning with each gasping breath, her fingers numb despite the gloves she wore. Behind her, she knew her brother Tobias and his men were tracking her, following the trail she left in the deep snow, like wolves following a wounded deer. She had stolen something from him, something he valued more than his own sister's life, and she knew with absolute certainty that if he caught her, he would kill her without hesitation. The fall seemed to last forever, and no time at all. Gwendolyn's shoulders slammed into an outcropping of rock, spinning her violently, and then her hips struck another ledge, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She tried to grab hold of something, anything, but her gloved hands found no purchase on the ice-slicked stone. Down and down she tumbled, her body bouncing off the cliff face like a rag doll, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through her bones. Finally, mercifully, her descent slowed. She crashed through a snow-laden pine branch that jutted out from a narrow ledge, the bough bending under her weight before depositing her onto a shelf of rock barely wide enough to hold her crumpled form. She lay there, gasping, tasting blood in her mouth, unable to move or think beyond the white, hot pain radiating through every inch of her body. Above her, she could hear shouting. Tobias. Her brother had reached the edge of the cliff, and through the ringing in her ears, she could make out his words carried on the wind. She went over the edge. No one could survive that fall. Come on, we are wasting time. She is dead, and the cold will take whatever is left of her. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than the apparent death of his own sister. Gwendolyn wanted to cry out, to curse him, but her body would not obey. She could only lie there trembling as the sounds of horses and men faded into the distance. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Gwendolyn forced her eyes open, blinking against the snowflakes that had begun to fall. The sky above was a pale gray, threatening more snow, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as the weak winter sun disappeared behind the mountains. She tried to move her fingers and was relieved when they responded, though each tiny movement sent jolts of pain up her arms. Her legs were another matter entirely. Her right ankle felt like it was made of broken glass, and when she tried to bend her left knee, the agony that lanced through her leg made her vision go dark at the edges. She was trapped on a ledge halfway down a frozen cliff face, injured and alone, with night approaching and the temperature plummeting. Even if she survived the cold, even if her injuries did not kill her, there was no way she could climb back up. The ledge she had landed on was perhaps 4 feet wide and maybe 8 feet long, barely large enough to keep her from rolling off into the abyss below. Looking over the edge made her stomach lurch as she saw nothing but a sheer drop disappearing into shadow and mist. Gwendolyn closed her eyes and tried to think. She still had the leather satchel strapped across her chest, the one she had taken from Tobias's safe 3 nights ago. Inside were documents, deeds, and evidence of her brother's crimes, proof that he had murdered their father and stolen the family ranch. She had planned to take it to the Marshall in Wallace, the small mining town nestled in the mountains of northern Idaho, but she had never made it. Tobias had discovered her theft within hours and had been hunting her ever since. The cold was seeping into her bones now, making her thoughts slow and heavy. She knew she should try to stay awake, try to keep moving, but the pain and exhaustion were overwhelming. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts, and darkness reached up to claim her. She did not hear the horse approaching on the trail far below. She did not hear the man's sharp intake of breath as he spotted her crumpled form on the ledge. She did not hear him dismount and begin calling up to her, his voice echoing off the rock walls. Preston Vale had been tracking elk through the mountains when he spotted the disturbed snow and the clear signs of a recent rockfall. As a cowboy who had spent the last 5 years working cattle drives and ranch work throughout Montana and Idaho, he knew these mountains as well as anyone. He had been heading back to Wallace with a string of wild horses he had caught and broken, planning to sell them to the logging companies that were always in need of strong draft animals. The winter had been particularly harsh, and he was looking forward to a hot meal and a warm bed at the boarding house in town. But when he looked up and saw the woman lying motionless on that narrow ledge, all thoughts of comfort vanished. Without hesitation, he began assessing the situation with the practical eye of a man who had spent his life dealing with difficult circumstances. The cliff face was nearly vertical, covered in ice, and treacherous in the extreme. Any rescue attempt would be dangerous, potentially fatal, but leaving her there was not an option he was willing to consider. Preston was 26 years old, tall and lean with the kind of strength that came from hard physical labor rather than bulk. His dark hair was shaggy beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and 3 days of stubble shadowed his jaw. His gray eyes, however, were sharp and calculating as he studied the cliff face, looking for a route. He called up to her again, louder this time, and thought he saw a slight movement. She was alive then, or had been moments ago. That was enough. Preston quickly unloaded his pack horse and retrieved every length of rope he had, tying them together and testing the knots with his full weight. He had perhaps 60 feet of rope, which might be enough if he was careful. The question was where to anchor it. The pine trees near the base of the cliff were too small and too far from where he needed to be. He walked along the trail, searching, and finally found what he needed: a massive boulder, at least 8 feet tall and solidly embedded in the frozen ground. He wrapped the rope around it multiple times, creating a secure anchor point, then tested it again. Preston stripped off his heavy coat, knowing it would only hinder his movements, and began the climb. The cold bit into him immediately through his wool shirt, but he ignored it, focusing entirely on finding handholds and footholds in the icy rock. The rope was tied around his waist, giving him some security, but it would do little good if he fell. The best it could do was keep his body from tumbling all the way to the bottom of the ravine. The climb was brutal. His fingers, even protected by leather gloves, quickly grew numb. Several times his boots slipped on patches of ice, and once his hand closed on a rock that came loose, sending him swinging sideways, slamming into the cliff face hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. But Preston had been dealing with ornery horses, stubborn cattle, and the harsh realities of frontier life since he was old enough to ride, and he was not the type to give up easily. It took him nearly an hour to reach the ledge, an hour during which the temperature continued to drop and the snowfall increased. By the time he hauled himself onto the narrow shelf beside the unconscious woman, his arms were shaking with fatigue, and his hands were raw inside his gloves. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably early 20s, with auburn hair that had come loose from its braid and now lay in a tangled mass around her pale face. Blood had dried on her temple and at the corner of her mouth, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. She wore a heavy coat, wool pants, and boots. Practical clothing for travel in these mountains, but her gloves were torn and her hat was gone, probably lost during her fall. "Miss, can you hear me?" Preston said, leaning close. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. He quickly checked her over, running his hands along her limbs as gently as he could through the layers of clothing. Her right ankle was badly swollen. He could feel that even through her boot, and when he touched her left leg just above the knee, she moaned, a sound of such profound pain that it made his chest tighten. Getting her down was going to be nearly impossible, but Preston had not climbed up here just to leave her. He untied the rope from around his own waist and began fashioning a makeshift harness, looping it under her arms and around her chest. The ledge was so narrow that he had to work carefully, constantly aware that one wrong move could send them both over the edge. I am going to get you down from here, he said, even though she could not hear him. Just hold on a little longer. The descent was a nightmare. Preston went first, climbing slowly down while managing the rope that held her. When he reached a relatively stable position, he began lowering her, inch by agonizing inch, using the rope and his own body weight to control her descent. Every few feet he had to stop, brace himself, and adjust the rope. His shoulders screamed in protest, his fingers could barely grip anymore, and twice the rope slipped and he had to catch it before she fell. By the time he finally got her to the ground, the sun had set completely and the temperature had plunged well below freezing. Preston collapsed beside her, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, his lungs burning from the cold air. But he could not rest yet. The woman needed shelter and warmth, and she needed them immediately. He forced himself to his feet and looked around. There was a small overhang in the rock face about 100 yards down the trail, barely more than a shallow cave, but it would have to do. Preston rigged a travois using branches and his saddle blanket, then carefully transferred the woman onto it. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Copper, stood patiently while Preston tied the travois to the saddle and began leading him slowly along the trail. The cave, when they reached it, was small and cold, but at least it blocked the wind and snow. Preston quickly gathered all the dry wood he could find, which was precious little, and got a fire started using the matches and kindling he always carried in his pack. As the flames grew, casting flickering light on the stone walls, he turned his attention back to the woman. Her color was bad, her lips tinged with blue, and she was shivering uncontrollably even though she was still unconscious. Preston knew the signs of severe cold exposure when he saw them. He needed to get her warm and fast. He spread out his bedroll near the fire, then carefully moved her onto it. Her clothing was damp from the snow, which was dangerous. He hesitated only a moment before beginning to remove her coat and outer layers, trying to preserve her modesty as much as possible, while also knowing that dry clothing could mean the difference between life and death. Under her coat, she wore a simple wool dress over a linen shirt and men's trousers, a practical combination for riding. Preston removed the damp outer layers and wrapped her in his spare blankets, then positioned her as close to the fire as he dared. He checked her injured leg again and felt his stomach sink. The swelling had increased, and the angle of her knee suggested a serious injury, possibly a break. Her ankle was definitely broken. He was certain of that now. Preston spent the next hour alternating between feeding the fire melting snow for water and monitoring the woman's condition. Her shivering gradually lessened as her body temperature stabilized, which was a good sign, but she remained unconscious. He cleaned the cuts on her face with melted snow and a strip of cloth torn from his spare shirt, noting that while they had bled quite a bit, they were not deep. The real concern was whether she had suffered any internal injuries from that terrible fall. As he worked, he noticed the leather satchel she wore. He had not removed it with her other clothing because it seemed important, strapped so securely to her body. Now, sitting beside her in the firelight, he wondered what could be inside that was worth carrying through these mountains in the dead of winter. It was none of his business, he told himself firmly. When she woke up, if she woke up, he would ask her what had happened and where she needed to go. The night was long and cold. Preston dozed fitfully, waking every time the woman stirred or the fire needed tending. Around what he guessed was 3 a.m, her eyes finally opened. For a moment she stared at the fire-lit ceiling of the cave with confusion. Then her gaze shifted to him and filled with terror. "Easy," Preston said quickly, holding up his hands. "You are safe. You fell from that cliff up there. I saw you and brought you down." Gwendolyn tried to sit up and immediately gasped, her hand going to her leg. "Do not move," Preston said, moving closer. "Your leg is injured badly. Your ankle, too. You need to stay still." "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Preston Vale. I was passing through with some horses when I spotted you. Can you tell me your name? She hesitated, and he saw calculation in her eyes despite the pain. She was trying to decide whether to trust him. Gwendolyn, she said finally, Gwendolyn Nash. Well, Miss Nash, you gave me quite a scare. What were you doing up on that cliff in this weather? The fear returned to her face, sharp and immediate. My brother. He was chasing me. Is he still out there? I have not seen anyone else, Preston said. Just you. What happened? Gwendolyn's hand went to the satchel, checking that it was still there, and Preston saw relief flash across her face when she felt it. How long have I been here? What time is it? Middle of the night. You fell yesterday afternoon. I got you down as fast as I could, but it took time. He paused, studying her face. Your brother was chasing you? Through these mountains? He thinks I am dead, Gwendolyn said, and there was something bleak and bitter in her voice. He said so. I heard him. He looked over the edge and decided no one could survive the fall, so he left. She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. I suppose I should be grateful for that. If he knew I was alive, he would come back to finish the job. Preston felt a cold anger settle in his gut. Your brother wants to kill you? My brother murdered our father, Gwendolyn said flatly. I have proof. Documents showing that he forged the will, that he hired men to make it look like an accident. I took them from his safe and ran. I was trying to get to Wallace, to the marshal, but Tobias and his men caught my trail. She looked at Preston with eyes that held too much pain and determination for someone so young. He cannot let me reach Wallace. If the truth comes out, he will hang. The story spilled out of her then, perhaps because she was injured and scared and had no one else to tell. She told him about growing up on the Nash ranch, about her father who had been a fair and honest man, about Tobias who had always been ambitious and ruthless. When their father had been thrown from his horse 6 months ago and broken his neck, everyone had called it a tragic accident. The will had been read, and to everyone's surprise, everything had been left to Tobias, with only a small monthly stipend for Gwendolyn. She had suspected something was wrong immediately. Her father had told her many times that the ranch would be split equally between his children, and he had never been the kind of man to change his mind on such things without telling her. She had started asking questions, digging into matters that Tobias had wanted left alone. 3 weeks ago, she had overheard him arguing with one of his men, a drifter named Calhoun, about payment for services rendered. The argument had been heated, and Tobias had threatened to kill Calhoun just like he had killed the old man if Calhoun did not keep his mouth shut. That had been all the confirmation Gwendolyn needed. She had waited until Tobias rode to town on business, then broke into his office and cracked the safe using the skills her father had taught her. Inside, she found the forged will, correspondence with Calhoun about the murder, and bank documents showing that Tobias had been stealing from the ranch accounts for years. She had taken everything, packed a bag, and fled into the mountains, heading for Wallace, and the territorial marshal she knew had an office there. I should have been more careful, Gwendolyn said, her voice thick with exhaustion and pain. I should have covered my trail better, but I panicked. And Tobias is a better tracker than I gave him credit for. They caught up to me on the second day. I ran, and eventually I ended up on that cliff path. The ice gave way beneath me, and then I was falling. Preston listened to all of this in silence, his jaw tight. He had seen plenty of evil in his years drifting across the frontier, but something about this situation made him particularly angry. Family was supposed to mean something. A brother was supposed to protect his sister, not hunt her down like an animal. You're not going to make it to Wallace on that leg, he said finally. Not for weeks, maybe months. It needs proper care, and even then you might not walk right again. Gwendolyn's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then he wins. Tobias wins, and my father's death goes unavenged, and I spent the rest of my life knowing that Monster controls everything Father built. I did not say we were not going to Wallace, Preston corrected. I said you are not making it there on that leg, but I am. It is only about 10 miles from here. I can be there and back with the marshal in less than a day. Hope flickered in her eyes. You would do that? You do not even know me. I know you fell off a cliff running from someone who wants you dead, Preston said. I know you are injured and alone. That is enough. He paused. But you need to trust me with those documents. The marshal will need to see them to understand the situation. Gwendolyn clutched the satchel to her chest, and Preston could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. These documents were the only thing keeping her alive, the only thing that mattered, and he was asking her to hand them over to a stranger. How do I know you will not just take them and disappear? She asked. How do I know you're not working with Tobias? You do not, Preston admitted. But if I wanted to hurt you or steal from you, I had all night to do it. You were unconscious and helpless. I could have taken that satchel and left you here to freeze. Instead, I risked my life climbing down that cliff to save you, and I have spent the whole night keeping you alive. He met her eyes steadily. I am not saying you should trust me blindly. I am saying you do not have many other options right now. It was harsh, but it was true, and they both knew it. Gwendolyn stared at him for a long moment, then slowly, painfully, began to unbuckle the satchel. She handed it to him with trembling fingers. If you betray me, she said quietly, I hope you can live with yourself. If I betray you, I would deserve whatever guilt came with it, Preston replied. He opened the satchel and quickly looked through the contents. Papers, legal documents, letters, all carefully organized and protected in oilcloth. He could see enough to know she was telling the truth. I will bring the marshal back here. We will keep this cave and the fire going. Can you manage on your own for a few hours? I have been on my own for days, Gwendolyn said. A few more hours will not kill me. Preston gathered wood and stacked it near the fire where she could reach it. He left her his water canteen, now filled with melted snow, and some jerky and hardtack from his supplies. He checked her injuries one more time, fashioning a rough splint for her ankle using straight branches and strips of cloth, which made her bite her lip until it bled to keep from screaming. I will be back as soon as I can, he promised. Then he mounted Copper, leaving his pack horse tied near the cave, and rode into the pre-dawn darkness toward Wallace. The ride to Wallace was brutal. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind cut through his clothes like knives. Preston pushed Copper as hard as he dared on the icy trail, knowing that every minute counted. The sun was just rising, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, when he finally rode into Wallace. The town was a rough collection of wooden buildings clinging to the sides of the mountains, supported by the silver mines that had drawn men to this harsh country. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and Preston could hear the sounds of activity as the town woke up to face another day. He headed straight for the marshal's office, a small building near the center of town. Marshal Henry Cooper was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. He looked up from his coffee as Preston burst through the door, and his eyebrows rose at Preston's appearance. Preston Vale, he said, you look like you have been wrestling bears. Worse, Preston said. I need your help, Marshal. There is a woman injured in the mountains, and her brother is trying to kill her. He laid out the story quickly and efficiently, then opened the satchel and spread the documents on the marshal's desk. Cooper's expression grew grimmer as he examined them, and by the time Preston finished talking, the marshal was on his feet. Tobias Nash, Cooper said. I have heard that name. He has a big spread down south of here, came to town a few times for supplies, always seemed a bit too smooth for my liking. He gathered up the documents and tucked them into his coat. If these are genuine, and they look genuine to me, then he is going to hang. Let me get my deputy, and we will ride out to your lady. Within the hour, Preston was leading Marshal Cooper and his deputy back into the mountains. The ride seemed to take forever, and Preston found himself anxious in a way he could not quite explain. He barely knew Gwendolyn Nash, had spent perhaps an hour total in her conscious company, but something about her situation had struck a chord deep inside him. Maybe it was the determination in her eyes or the way she had trusted him with those documents despite having every reason not to. Maybe it was simply that she had needed help, and he had been in a position to give it. When they finally reached the cave, Preston's heart was pounding. What if she had gotten worse? What if her injuries had taken a turn? What if Tobias had somehow found her? But when he ducked into the cave, Gwendolyn was exactly where he had left her, propped against the rock wall with the fire burning steadily beside her. Her face was pale and drawn with pain, but her eyes were alert and focused on the entrance. She held a large rock in her hand, he noticed, ready to use as a weapon if needed. When she saw him, relief flooded her features. "You came back," she said, and he heard the surprise in her voice. "I said I would," Preston replied. He stepped aside to let Marshal Cooper and his deputy enter. "Miss Nash, this is Marshal Cooper." I showed him the documents. Cooper removed his hat as he approached Gwendolyn. "Miss Nash, I am glad to see you alive. Preston here told me quite a story. Those documents you found are going to put your brother away for a very long time." Gwendolyn's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "You believe me? You will arrest him?" "I have already sent a telegram to the territorial authorities," Cooper said. "They are dispatching deputies to your ranch right now to take Tobias Nash into custody. He will face trial for murder and fraud." He crouched down to examine her injuries, his expression turning serious. "But right now we need to get you to a doctor. Preston says your leg is badly hurt." The journey back to Wallace was slow and painful despite their best efforts. They had brought a proper stretcher, but every bump and jostle made Gwendolyn gasp with pain. Preston rode beside the stretcher the entire time, and more than once he reached out to take her hand when the pain became too much, surprised when she held on tightly, her grip desperate and trusting. The doctor in Wallace was a no-nonsense woman named Catherine Hall, who had come west with her husband 20 years ago to seek their fortune in the mines. When her husband had died of lung fever, she had stayed using the medical knowledge she had learned from her father to care for the miners and townspeople. She took one look at Gwendolyn's leg and shook her head. "This is bad," she said bluntly. "The knee is dislocated, and there is significant swelling. The ankle is definitely broken in at least 2 places. She is lucky to be alive. Luckier still that infection has not set in yet." The process of setting Gwendolyn's injuries was something Preston would never forget. He held her shoulders while Dr. Hall and the marshal manipulated her knee back into place, and Gwendolyn's screams echoed through the small clinic. She passed out halfway through, which was probably a mercy. The ankle was next. And by the time Dr. Hall had finished splinting and wrapping both injuries, Preston felt sick to his stomach. "She will need to stay completely off that leg for at least 6 weeks, Maria," Dr. Hall said, washing her hands in a basin. "No weight on it at all. After that, we will see how it heals. She is young and strong, which works in her favor, but injuries like this can be unpredictable. She might walk with a limp for the rest of her life, or she might recover fully. Only time will tell." Preston found himself hoping fiercely that it would be the latter. Gwendolyn had already lost so much. She deserved to heal completely. Marshal Cooper arranged for Gwendolyn to stay in a room at the boarding house, a clean but simple establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. Preston paid for the room himself before the marshal could offer, ignoring Cooper's knowing look. He also paid Dr. Hall for her services and arranged for meals to be brought to Gwendolyn 3 times a day. "You are spending a lot of money on a stranger," Cooper observed, as they stood outside the boarding house that evening. "She has no one else," Preston said. "Her brother killed her father and stole her inheritance. The least I can do is make sure she has a place to recover." "Decent of you," Cooper said. He clapped Preston on the shoulder. "I got word back from the territorial deputies. Tobias Nash is in custody. He will be transported to Boise for trial. You did a good thing, Preston. You saved that girl's life." Preston nodded, but he was not thinking about heroics or good deeds. He was thinking about the way Gwendolyn had looked at him when she handed over that satchel, the way she had held his hand during the agonizing ride back to town. He was thinking that maybe he would stay in Wallace for a while, at least until she was back on her feet. The next morning, Preston sold his string of horses to the logging company for a fair price, then took a room at the boarding house for himself. When he knocked on Gwendolyn's door and asked if she needed anything, she looked at him with such surprise that it made his chest ache. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "I thought you would move on now that you have done your part." "I thought I would stick around for a bit," Preston said. "Make sure you are all right. Besides, Wallace seems like a decent place to spend the rest of the winter." The truth was that Preston had been drifting for years, moving from ranch to ranch, cattle drive to cattle drive, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. His own family was back in Wyoming, a father he barely spoke to, and two brothers he had not seen in 3 years. The frontier was full of men like him, restless and rootless, always looking for the next job, the next town, the next adventure. But sitting in that small room watching Gwendolyn struggle to sit up without putting weight on her injured leg, Preston felt something shift inside him. He felt like maybe he had been looking for something all these years without knowing what it was, and maybe he had just found it. Over the following weeks, Preston became a regular presence in Gwendolyn's recovery. He brought her books from the general store, taught her to play cards to pass the time, and told her stories about his years on the frontier. In turn, she told him about growing up on the ranch, about her father who had taught her to ride and shoot and think for herself, about the life that had been stolen from her. They talked about everything and nothing. Preston learned that Gwendolyn loved to read but had rarely had access to books growing up. She learned that he had left home at 18 after a fight with his father and had been wandering ever since, working whatever jobs he could find. They discovered they had the same dry sense of humor, the same appreciation for honest conversation, the same quiet determination to face whatever life threw at them. Preston found himself looking forward to each visit with an intensity that surprised him. The way Gwendolyn's face lit up when he entered the room, the sound of her laugh when he told a particularly ridiculous story about breaking wild horses, the comfortable silences that fell between them as they sat by the window watching snow fall over the mountains, all of it felt important in a way he could not quite articulate. 6 weeks after the accident, Dr. Hall examined Gwendolyn's leg and declared that she could begin trying to put weight on it. The first time she stood, leaning heavily on Preston's arm and a crutch Dr. Hall had fashioned, tears streamed down her face. "It hurts," she said through gritted teeth, "but I am standing. I was so afraid I would never walk again." "You are the strongest person I know," Preston said, and he meant it. "If anyone can recover from this, it is you." The process of learning to walk again was slow and frustrating. Some days Gwendolyn could only manage a few steps before the pain became too much. Other days she pushed herself too hard and ended up setting back her recovery. Through it all, Preston was there, offering his arm, his encouragement, his steady presence. Spring came to the mountains, bringing with it the thaw and the return of life to the frozen landscape. News came that Tobias Nash had been tried and convicted of murder. He was sentenced to hang, the execution to take place in May. Marshal Cooper offered to take Gwendolyn to Boise to witness it if she wanted, but she declined. "He's already dead to me," she told Preston. "Watching him hang would not bring my father back or undo what he did. I just want to move forward." Moving forward, however, raised difficult questions. The ranch that had been stolen from her father was now legally hers, the courts having voided Tobias's fraudulent will. But the ranch was a full week's ride to the south, and Gwendolyn was not yet ready for that kind of journey. More than that, she was not sure she wanted to return to a place filled with so many painful memories. "I keep thinking about selling it," she told Preston one evening in late April. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house watching the sun set over the mountains, taking whatever money I can get and starting fresh somewhere new. "That would be a shame," Preston said. "Your father built that ranch. It is part of your family's legacy." "A legacy my brother tried to murder me for," Gwendolyn pointed out. "Every time I think about going back there, all I can see is Tobias and what he did. How can I live in my father's house knowing that is where my brother planned his murder? How can I work land that cost my father his life?" Preston did not have an easy answer for that. He understood the impulse to run from painful places, had done plenty of running himself over the years, but he also understood that running did not always solve anything. "What if you did not have to do it alone?" he asked quietly. Gwendolyn turned to look at him, and Preston felt his heart start to race. This was it, the moment he had been building toward for weeks without quite realizing it. "What do you mean?" I mean, I am good with horses and cattle. I know ranch work inside and out. I could help you rebuild what your brother destroyed, help you turn that place into something you could be proud of instead of something you are afraid of." He paused, gathering his courage. "If you wanted me to, that is. If you wanted me to stay." The silence that followed felt like it lasted a year. Gwendolyn studied his face, her green eyes searching for something, and Preston forced himself to meet her gaze steadily, even though his palms were sweating. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "Why would you give up your freedom to tie yourself to a ranch and a woman you barely know?" "I have been free for 8 years," Preston said. "I have drifted from Montana to Colorado to Oregon and back again. I have worked 100 different ranches for 100 different men. And you know what I have learned? Freedom is not worth much if you have nothing and no one to care about. As for barely knowing you, I think we've gotten to know each other pretty well these past months, and what I know is that I admire you. I admire your courage, your determination, the way you never gave up even when your own brother was hunting you. I admire the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, and the way you refuse to feel sorry for yourself even when you had every right to. I admire you, Gwendolyn." And somewhere along the way, admiration turned into something more. Gwendolyn's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You are saying you have feelings for me." "I am saying I am falling in love with you," Preston corrected. "Have been for weeks, probably. Maybe since the moment I saw you on that ledge and knew I had to save you, or maybe since the first time you laughed at something I said, or maybe it was 100 little moments in between. I do not know exactly when it happened. I just know that it did." "Preston," she whispered, and there was wonder in her voice. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and sure. "I have been falling in love with you too. I was afraid to say anything, afraid you would think I was just grateful or confused or traumatized by everything that happened. But it is not gratitude I feel when you walk into a room and my heart starts racing. It is not confusion that makes me think about you constantly, that makes me replay our conversations in my head. And it is not trauma that makes me want to reach for your hand, that makes me feel safe and happy and hopeful when you are near." Preston brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then come back to the ranch with me. Let me help you rebuild. Let us make something good out of all this pain." "Are you sure?" Gwendolyn asked. "It is a hard life, ranching, and there will be talk when people find out we are running a place together without being married." "Then we will get married," Preston said simply, "if you will have me. I know this is fast, and I know we have only known each other a few months, but I am sure about this, Gwendolyn. I am sure about you." Gwendolyn laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Preston's heart soar. "Are you proposing to me, Preston Vale?" "I suppose I am," Preston said, grinning. "Not the most romantic proposal in the world, sitting on a boarding house porch talking about ranch work and local gossip, but it is honest. So what do you say, Gwendolyn Nash? Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Wallace. Marshal Cooper stood up as Preston's witness, and Dr. Hall stood for Gwendolyn. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house baked them a cake, and half the town turned out to wish them well. Gwendolyn wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson helped her sew, and she walked down the aisle with only the slightest limp, though Preston knew it still hurt her. Preston wore his best clothes, which was not saying much, but Gwendolyn looked at him like he was the finest gentleman she had ever seen. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her gently, aware of all the watching eyes, but caring only about the woman in his arms. Gwendolyn kissed him back with a fierce joy that promised a lifetime of love and partnership and shared dreams. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, and Preston was gentle with her, mindful of her still healing leg. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Gwendolyn curled against his chest, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he was meant to be. This was what he had been looking for all those years of drifting. In June, when Gwendolyn was walking well enough for sustained travel, they packed their belongings and headed south toward the Nash Ranch. The journey took them a week, traveling slowly to accommodate Gwendolyn's leg, and Preston used the time to tell her his plans for the ranch. He wanted to focus on breeding quality horses rather than running massive cattle herds, thought they could build a reputation for solid, reliable stock that would sell well to the army and to other ranchers. Gwendolyn listened to his ideas and added her own. She wanted to hire some of the men who had worked for her father, good men who had left when Tobias took over. She wanted to rebuild the barn that had burned down the previous year, expand the horse corrals, maybe even build a proper house to replace the old cabin her grandfather had built. When they finally crested the hill and saw the ranch spread out below them, Preston felt Gwendolyn tense beside him. The place looked run down, neglected in the months since Tobias had been arrested. Fences were broken, the corrals were empty, and weeds had overgrown the vegetable garden near the house. "It is worse than I thought," Gwendolyn said quietly. "It is a place that needs work," Preston corrected. "That is all. We have time, and we have each other. We will make it right." They rode down into the ranch yard, and Preston helped Gwendolyn dismount. Together they walked through the property, taking stock of what needed to be done. It was a long list, daunting in its scope, but Preston had meant what he said. They had time. They started with the house, cleaning out the months of dust and neglect, making the space livable again. Preston repaired the roof where it had started to leak, and Gwendolyn scrubbed the floors until they shone. They aired out the bedding, cleared out the rodents that had moved in, and slowly transformed the cabin into a home. Next came the hard work of repairing fences and corrals. Preston reached out to some of the men he had worked with over the years, and by late summer, they had hired 3 hands who were willing to work for modest wages in exchange for a share of the profits when the ranch turned around. 2 of them, Charlie and Tom, had worked for Gwendolyn's father years ago and were happy to return. The third, a young man named James, was green but eager to learn. Gwendolyn proved to be every bit as capable as Preston had suspected. She could ride, though her injured leg tired more easily than it used to, and she had a good eye for horses. Together they traveled to auctions and bought their foundation stock, a mix of sturdy mares and a magnificent black stallion that Preston saw potential in. The work was hard, the hours long, and there were setbacks and frustrations aplenty, but at the end of each day, Preston and Gwendolyn would sit on the porch of their little house, watching the sun set over the mountains, and talk about their progress. In those moments, with Gwendolyn's hand in his and the ranch slowly coming back to life around them, Preston felt a contentment he had never known before. Their first winter on the ranch was challenging. Money was tight, and there were times Preston worried they might not make it. But they had stocked the root cellar carefully, laid in enough hay and grain for the horses, and prepared as best they could. When the snows came deep and heavy, Preston was grateful for the good solid roof over their heads and the warmth of the fire in the hearth. More than that, he was grateful for Gwendolyn. They spent the long winter evenings talking, reading, playing cards, and simply enjoying each other's company. Preston learned new dimensions of his wife with each passing day. He learned that she sang while she cooked, that she was terrible at checkers but excellent at poker, that she had a gift for telling stories that made him laugh until his sides hurt. He learned the way she liked her coffee, the way she wrinkled her nose when she was thinking hard about something, the way she sighed contentedly when he pulled her close at night. And Gwendolyn learned about him too. She learned about the complicated relationship he had with his father, about the guilt he carried for leaving his family behind, about his dreams and fears and the parts of himself he had never shared with anyone. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, about the war he had been too young to fight in but old enough to remember, about the violence he had witnessed on the frontier. She learned to wake him gently from those nightmares, to hold him until the shaking stopped, to remind him that he was safe and loved. Spring came again, bringing with it new life and new opportunities. The mares they had bought the previous year started foaling, and the ranch was suddenly filled with long-legged babies learning to run. Preston and Gwendolyn spent hours watching them, marveling at their beauty and grace, seeing in them the future they were building together. In May, Gwendolyn told Preston she was pregnant. They were mending a fence together when she said it so casually that at first he thought he had misheard. "What did you say?" "I am pregnant," Gwendolyn repeated, smiling at his stunned expression. "Dr. Hall confirmed it when I rode into Wallace last week. The baby should come in late autumn." Preston dropped his hammer and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly that she laughed and protested she could not breathe. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder filling his voice. "You and me, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Gwendolyn asked, though she could surely see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Preston said. He kissed her, long and deep, pouring all his joy and love into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, he was grinning like a fool. "We are going to need to build that bigger house sooner rather than later." "We have time," Gwendolyn said, echoing his words from a year ago. "We have each other, and we have time." The months that followed were busy and joyful. Preston threw himself into building an addition onto the cabin, determined that his child would have a proper room to grow up in. The ranch hands teased him mercilessly about his sudden frenzy of construction, but they pitched in to help, and by September the new rooms were complete. Gwendolyn continued working as long as she could, though Preston worried constantly about her overdoing it. She would laugh at his hovering and tell him she was pregnant, not made of glass, but she also seemed touched by his concern. As her belly grew round with their child, Preston found himself struck again and again by how beautiful she was, how strong, how absolutely perfect. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving in a rush after a labor that terrified Preston, even though Dr. Hall, who had ridden out from Wallace, assured him everything was progressing normally. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, Preston felt tears stream down his face. Gwendolyn was exhausted but radiant, cradling their son against her chest with a look of fierce love. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Look at him, Preston. We made him." Preston looked at his son, at the tiny, perfect face and the miniature fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He is incredible," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are incredible." They named him David, after Gwendolyn's father, and from the moment he entered the world, David Nash Vale became the center of their universe. Preston had never imagined himself as a father, had never really thought about children during all his years of drifting, but now he could not imagine his life without this small person who depended on him and Gwendolyn for everything. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Their horses developed a reputation for quality and soundness, and buyers came from as far away as Oregon and Colorado to purchase Preston's stock. Money was no longer a constant worry, and they were able to expand their operation, hire more hands, improve their facilities. When David was 2, Gwendolyn gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Michael and Grace. The house that had seemed so spacious suddenly felt cramped, and Preston found himself planning yet another addition. Gwendolyn teased him that at this rate, they would end up with a mansion, but she approved the plans and pitched in where she could, even with 3 small children demanding her attention. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and injuries, market downturns and difficult decisions, but Preston and Gwendolyn faced every challenge together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each passing year. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Gwendolyn back to Wallace, leaving the children with Charlie and his wife, who had moved onto the ranch the previous year. They stayed at the same boarding house where they had first fallen in love, and Mrs. Patterson, now elderly but still sharp as a tack, fussed over them like they were her own children. Preston and Gwendolyn walked through the town, visiting old haunts and reminiscing about those early days. They stopped at Dr. Hall's clinic, now run by a younger doctor since Catherine Hall had retired, and laughed about how terrified Preston had been when Gwendolyn was learning to walk again. They visited the church where they had been married and sat quietly in the pews, holding hands and remembering their vows. That evening, they rode out to the cave where Preston had first brought Gwendolyn after her fall. It was summer now, and the mountains were green and lush. Nothing like the frozen wasteland it had been that terrible February. They climbed up to the ledge where Preston had found her, though it took them a while since the trail was overgrown. Standing there, looking out over the valley with Gwendolyn beside him, Preston thought about how much had changed. 10 years ago he had been a drifter with no ties and no purpose beyond the next job. Gwendolyn had been a frightened woman running for her life, injured and alone. Now they stood here together, husband and wife, partners and parents, looking back on a decade of hard work and love and the life they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked. "Marrying me, staying on the ranch, all of it?" Gwendolyn looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Regret it? Preston, you saved my life. Not just that day on the cliff, though that too, but in every way that matters. You gave me a reason to keep going when I had lost everything. You gave me love and partnership and a future I never thought I would have. You gave me our children and our home and our life together. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I just wanted to make sure," Preston said, pulling her close, "because I do not regret a single moment. Not the climb down that cliff, not the hard early years on the ranch, not the sleepless nights with crying babies or the times we barely had enough money to feed the horses. All of it was worth it to be here with you now." They stood there watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Preston thought about the chain of events that had led them to this moment. If Gwendolyn had not run from her brother, if she had not fallen from that cliff, if he had not been passing through at exactly the right moment, their lives would have been completely different. They would never have met, never fallen in love, never built the life they now shared. It was terrifying to think how easily it all could have gone wrong. If Tobias had caught her before she fell, if Preston had ridden past without looking up, if she had not survived her injuries, there were 1,000 ways their story could have ended in tragedy instead of happiness. But it had not. Against all odds, despite all the pain and fear and difficulty, they had found each other. They had fought for each other and built something beautiful together. And now, standing here a decade later, Preston knew with absolute certainty that he would climb that cliff 1,000 times over if it meant he got to spend his life with Gwendolyn. "I love you," he said. The words inadequate, but heartfelt. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Gwendolyn replied, turning in his arms to kiss him. "Thank you for saving me, Preston Vale. Thank you for seeing me when I was broken and scared and believing I was worth saving. Thank you for building this life with me." They rode back to Wallace as the stars came out and spent the night at the boarding house making love and talking about their children, their plans for the ranch, their dreams for the future. In the morning, they would ride back to their home, back to their children and their responsibilities and the life they had built. But for now, for this one perfect night, it was just the two of them, remembering where they had started and marveling at where they had ended up. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. David grew into a serious young man who loved horses as much as his father did. Michael was more adventurous, always getting into scrapes and coming home with torn clothes and scraped knees. Grace was thoughtful and kind, with her mother's determination and her father's steady temperament. When David turned 16, Preston began teaching him the finer points of running the ranch, preparing him to take over someday. But that day was still far in the future, and Preston was in no hurry to step back. He loved his work, loved the horses, loved the daily rhythm of ranch life. More than anything, he loved coming in at the end of a long day to find Gwendolyn in the kitchen cooking dinner, or reading on the porch, or working on the accounts at the big desk they had bought in Boise. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But when Preston looked at Gwendolyn, he still saw the brave young woman he had pulled off that frozen cliff. He still felt his heart race when she smiled at him. He still reached for her hand without thinking whenever they were close enough to touch. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Preston woke before dawn and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Gwendolyn. He made coffee and carried 2 cups out to the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains they had called home for so long. When he heard the door open behind him, he smiled without turning around. "Could not sleep?" Gwendolyn asked, settling into the chair beside him and accepting the coffee he offered. "Just thinking," Preston said, "about how lucky I am. About how different my life could have been if I had ridden past that cliff without looking up." "I think about that sometimes too," Gwendolyn admitted, "about how close I came to dying that day, about how you risked your life to save someone you did not even know. You are a good man, Preston Vale. You always have been." "I am a man who found something worth living for," Preston corrected. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "I spent so many years drifting, thinking I was free, thinking I was living, but I was just existing. You taught me the difference." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher, bathing the ranch in golden light. In the corrals, the horses were starting to move around, their morning feeding time approaching. In the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of their children, grown now with families of their own, starting to stir. David and his wife had moved into the old cabin with their 3 children. Michael worked in town but visited often with his wife and young son. Grace had married a neighboring rancher and lived just a few miles down the valley with her husband and twin daughters. The ranch that Preston and Gwendolyn had rebuilt together now supported their entire family, and would continue to do so for generations to come. The Nash name, which Tobias had tried to destroy, had been restored and given new honor through their hard work and dedication. "We did it," Gwendolyn said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "We took something broken and made it whole again. We took a legacy of murder and greed and transformed it into something good." "We did," Preston agreed, "together." "Always together," Gwendolyn said, squeezing his hand. They finished their coffee as the ranch came alive around them, and Preston thought that this was happiness. Not the dramatic rescue or the passionate early days of their romance, though those had been important too. This was happiness. This quiet morning moment with the woman he loved, surrounded by the life they had built and the family they had raised. This was the reward for all the hard work and struggle and sacrifice. Preston Vale had climbed down a frozen cliff 30 years ago to save a woman's life, and in doing so had saved his own. He had found love, purpose, and a home in the most unexpected of places. And every single day since, he had been grateful for the twist of fate that had brought Gwendolyn Nash into his life. As they stood to go inside and greet their family, to start another day on the ranch they had built together, Preston pulled Gwendolyn close and kissed her forehead. She looked up at him with eyes that still held the same fierce determination and love he had first seen in that cave all those years ago. "Here is to 30 more years," he said. Gwendolyn laughed. "We will be ancient." "Then we will be ancient together," Preston replied, "just like we have done everything else." They walked inside hand in hand, ready to face whatever the day brought, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together. The story that had begun with terror and pain on a frozen cliff had become a story of love and redemption, of partnership and perseverance, of 2 people who had saved each other in every way that mattered. Years later, when Preston was in his 70s and Gwendolyn not far behind, they made one final trip to Wallace. The town had grown considerably, the mines still producing, though not as richly as before. The boarding house where they had stayed was now run by Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, and Marshal Cooper had long since retired, though his legacy of fairness and justice lived on in the officers who followed him. They visited Dr. Hall's grave, laying flowers and thanking her memory for the care she had provided. They walked through the town, noting the changes, but also the things that remained the same. And once more they rode out to the cliff where their story had begun. The climb up to the ledge was harder now, their aging bodies protesting the effort, but they persevered. Standing there, looking out over the valley that had been their home for 40 years, Preston felt the weight of time and the gift of the years they had shared. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every challenge. I would do it all again in a heartbeat if it meant I got to spend my life with you." "So would I," Gwendolyn said, leaning against him. "You gave me everything, Preston. Love, family, purpose, home. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave that to each other," Preston corrected gently. "Neither of us could have done it alone." They stood there until the sun began to set, and then carefully made their way back down to their horses. The ride back to the ranch was slow and peaceful, and by the time they arrived, their grandchildren were waiting on the porch, eager to hear stories about the old days. Preston and Gwendolyn settled into their chairs surrounded by family and began to tell the story one more time. The story of a frozen cliff and a desperate flight, of a cowboy who climbed down to save a stranger's life, of love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was their story, the foundation upon which everything else had been built, and it never got old in the telling. As the evening wore on and the grandchildren eventually drifted off to bed, Preston and Gwendolyn remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars come out. They had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and meaning. And if fate had offered Preston the choice to go back and change anything, to avoid the hardships and struggles they had faced, he would have refused without hesitation. Because every moment, good and bad, had led them here. Every challenge had made them stronger. Every hardship had brought them closer. And the love they shared, forged in adversity and tempered by time, was worth more than all the gold in the Idaho mountains. Preston kissed his wife's hand and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me that day. Thank you for letting me save you." Gwendolyn smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for being there to catch me when I fell. Thank you for showing me what love could be." They sat together under the stars, two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. Their children would carry on the ranch, and their grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of how their grandparents had met. The legacy they left behind was not one of wealth or fame, but of love, partnership, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest moments, hope and redemption were possible. Preston Vale and Gwendolyn Nash had saved each other. In every way, two people could save one another. And they had lived happily ever after, not because their life was easy or perfect, but because they had faced every challenge together, hand in hand, heart to heart, building something that would endure long after their own story had ended. Their love had transformed tragedy into triumph, fear into courage, and loneliness into belonging. It was a love story for the ages, born on a frozen cliff in the wild mountains of Idaho, and it would be remembered and cherished by all who came after them,